I've done several of these History Traveler videos now, and it seems almost criminal that I've gone through all of these trips and all of these videos and have yet to visit a Civil War battle site. Well, I am fixing that today, right here at Fort Donelson National Battlefield in Tennessee. Now, during the 1800s, rivers were of vital importance to the United States. They were kind of like our interstate today. They were the major arteries that materials and weapons and things like that traveled on. So whenever the Civil War broke out, it became vitally important to both sides to not only protect the rivers, but to also try and capture different points, because that was going to be the access either into the South or into the North. Well, that's where Fort Donelson comes in. In Tennessee, there was a line that the Confederates were guarding that stretched pretty thinly all the way across the northern Tennessee border and the southern Kentucky border. Two rivers that came down out of the north and into the south were the Tennessee and the Cumberland River, and two forts were protecting them. One was Fort Henry over on the Tennessee River, and then this one that we're going to be looking at today, Fort Donelson, which was on the Cumberland River. So under the leadership of U.S. Grant, the Union had already taken Fort Henry and then started moving in on Fort Donelson. That was in February of 1863. So we're going to go to the Visitor Center and go see what else we can learn before we start touring this battlefield. All right, so here we are at the Fort Donelson Visitor Center, and unfortunately we're not going in because it is closed for renovations. This seems to happen to me quite a bit, but that's okay. We're going to go ahead and go through the battlefield and see what we can learn anyway. Well, that's a real bummer, because I was planning on getting some cool shots of this place today. So note that if you see any drone shots in this video, it is not going to be here on the battlefield. So don't be calling and turning me into anybody. Now, Fort Donelson is not what you would consider a typical fort. Usually whenever I think of a fort, I think of something made of brick or stone or maybe a wooden structure, and that's not what Fort Donelson was. Fort Donelson was made up of what you call earthworks. So what happened was Confederate soldiers and slaves would build up these huge earthen walls that were made of logs and earth about 10 foot tall, and they did it around the perimeter of the fort, which was about 15 acres. Now, due to the fact that erosion would completely destroy these earthworks, you're not allowed to get up on top of them, but you can kind of see them right here behind me. And I'm going to show a few of these and do my best to give everyone a little bit of a view of what these earthworks would have looked like. It's pretty fascinating. So here's another look at the outer perimeter of Fort Donelson. And I would say that, this is probably 6 or 7 foot deep, and you can see where the walls go up. That's probably about 10 foot tall. So as you can imagine, it would be pretty difficult to attack and a lot easier to defend. Now, this is from the inside of the earthen walls. You can see where like artillery would have been positioned. And then Confederate soldiers would have been right here in this area to mount a defense of Fort Donelson. Let me go over here and I'll lift the camera up and you can get kind of a decent view from the side of these earthen forts. So this is on the western side of Fort Donelson. Now here is how Fort Donelson would have originally looked during the Civil War. So the spot that I just showed is right here, hence the "you are here" spot. And we're going to drive around and go over here to the river batteries that defended against the Union incursion on the Cumberland River. But this is Fort Donelson, so all of this right here would have been Confederate quarters. Interesting. Here's an example of the living quarters that you would have found at Fort Donelson for the Confederates. And there were about 400 of these that were built by Confederate soldiers and slave laborers. So you'd of course have your log structure, a little fireplace in the back made out of stone and mortar, and then a canvas rooftop. I'll go around here and take a look inside this thing. Okay, got some straw on the floor, and then there's your fireplace to kind of keep you out of the elements. Now this battle took place during February, so it would have been really cold. Guarantee that this would have been much more preferable than a tent. These all ended up getting burned down though because there was a measles outbreak. So this is a replica of what the Confederate living quarters would have looked like here inside of Fort Donelson. They would have been scattered all throughout the valley here, inside the fort. Holy crud, there goes an eagle. How neat is that? Hey, looky there. Happened to catch a barge moving up or rather down the Cumberland River. Golly, that thing is big. Okay, well I am now on the eastern side of Fort Donelson, right along the Cumberland River on the lower gun battery. Pretty cool place. We're down here kind of in the trenches, and all along here, you can kind of see up here too, there were 8 Confederate guns that were manning positions guarding the Cumberland River here on the lower battery. And as you can see, let me move up here a little bit. Whenever the Union ironclads under the command of Andrew Foote crossed right through here and came around the bend, they were pretty much in open range of these Confederate guns, and they were not successful in moving in on Fort Donelson and had to turn back. And Grant ended up having to have his men come up from the western edge. But pretty cool to be down here in these spots where the Confederates were defending Fort Donelson. And you can see here there's a gun missing. I think one of the guns ended up getting hit by the Union boats. But you can see they've kind of reconstructed these sandbags. Got these earthworks, which probably are better than stone because they're more capable of absorbing energy from a cannonball blast. But very, very interesting. was just getting ready to leave the trenches and happened to see this reconstructed powder magazine. Pretty interesting. So this would have been a one-room structure that was doubled up with logs to make it more bomb-proof, and then have, you know, earthworks covering it, and would have held about 1,000 rounds for the guns of the Lower River Battery here. Pretty interesting to be here. Now here are 4 more mounds that were built by the Confederates that had some 32-pound cannon behind them, but they ended up moving them before the gunboat attack. So this is behind the lower battery, but they figured it would be ineffective from here, and the lower battery had it covered. But man, oh man, hard to imagine how the Union would have been successful with an amphibious invasion on this fort, just seeing the defenses. So I just left the eastern edge of Fort Donelson, which forms the gun battery that is right there on the Cumberland River. So February 14th is whenever the Union boats were turned back. And the spot where I'm standing at right now is back on the outer perimeter on the western side of Fort Donelson, on a ridge that formed kind of a defensive line before you actually got to the fort. And on the 15th, you can see a cannon and some of these earthworks and trenches behind me. On the 15th of February, the Union mounted an assault up here on this ridge. They drove the Confederates off of this ridge, and if I cross this road, you can see that there's a ravine that dips back down into here. Drove the Confederates down into that ravine, up on the next ridge, and then the Union just kind of encamped here, and we're waiting to move into the actual 15-acre fort itself on the 16th, but they didn't have to, because the commander of the fort offered up a surrender to General Grant, and that concluded the Battle of Fort Donelson. Was a huge victory for the Union. Really kind of helped Grant make a name for himself, and gave the Union kind of an open incursion into the South. So in the East, where the Union wasn't doing so well, it was pretty discouraging. But here in the West, at places like Fort Henry and Fort Donelson, there were signs of hope. We have one more stop that we're going to make, and then we're going to wrap up this visit to Fort Donelson. Our last stop here at Fort Donelson is at the Fort Donelson National Cemetery, which is the final resting place of those that fought in that battle. Just like Arlington, Normandy, these national cemeteries serve as a reminder to us of what the cost of war is, and what the price of freedom is. It's one thing to sit in school and learn about history. It's another to read about history, and those are both good things. But it's on another level to come out here to the place where these men and women walked, fought, made history, and actually experience it for yourself. So I only scratched the surface today on the Battle of Fort Donelson. So look it up for yourself, and then if you ever have a chance, come here to Dover, Tennessee, to the battle site of Fort Donelson. It's a pretty amazing place.